The student should not learn thoughts, but rather to think. The philosophy teacher should not carry him, but guide him, if we want him to be able to walk on his own in the future. This is a famous quote by Immanuel Kant during one of his university courses. Teaching people how to think on their own, to encourage them to use their own reason, was always his great pedagogical purpose. Very famous is his Latin quote sapere aude, taken from Horace, which means dare to know. Everyone usually describes Kant as a cold, introvert thinker, not very friendly and always on his own. But this is not true. Behind the genius philosopher, behind this brilliant mind that changed the history forever, there is a truly genuine, humble and kind person. Thomas de Quincey writes in his biography titled The Last Days of Immanuel Kant. There was no friend of Kant who did not consider the day he would dine with him as a festive day. Without giving himself the air of a master, Kant truly was one to the highest degree. The entire entertainment was seasoned with the spices of his enlightened spirit, which naturally and unaffectedly poured forth on the subjects that conversation progressed, and time flew by rapidly, from 1 o'clock to 4, to 5, and even later, to the benefit and pleasure of all. So who is truly Immanuel Kant, and how did he turn into a legend in the history of philosophy? This is the first video of a series dedicated to who could be arguably considered the greatest philosopher of all time. In this video specifically, we will focus on his life and his pre-critical phase, in order to see the development of this philosopher before his greatest work, the Critique of Pure Reason. Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg, East Prussia, in 1724, into a modest family. His mother, Regina Reuter, was deeply religious and had a strong influence on his upbringing. Kant studied at the Collegium Fridericianum, where he was influenced on one side by the Pietism, a strict religious movement, and on the other one by the philosophy of Christian Wolff. In 1740, he began studying physics and mathematics at Königsberg's University. These early experiences shaped his ideas. Pietism gave him a moral seriousness. Wolff's rationalism became a reference point, often challenged. And empirism, especially through reading Hume, pushed him to question the pure reason. After his father's death in 1746, Kant worked as a private tutor while continuing his studies. In 1755, he earned the right to teach at the university with a thesis on fire and another on metaphysics, in which he criticized Wolff's rationalism. Between 1755 and 1770, Kant lectured on physics and metaphysics. Although his teaching was popular, he did not yet receive a full academic recognition. During this time, he read important works by Rousseau and Hume, which deeply influenced his ethical and philosophical thinking. In 1770, Kant finally became a full professor. That year, he published the inaugural Dissertation, which marks the transition from his early period to his later critical philosophy. He then worked over a decade revising his ideas, eventually publishing his most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, in 1781. The book wasn't well received at first, so in 1783 he published the more accessible version called Prolegomena. For a moment, I'd like you to pay attention to this little detail. Kant dedicated 10 years of his life to elaborate an idea. This shows not that much of a miraculous genius whose life was always easy due to his capacities, but rather a man who with great humility dedicated his life to the purpose of searching the truth. Thomas de Quincey writes, "Rarely, or rather never, did he steer the conversation towards any branch of philosophy that he himself had founded. Indeed, he was entirely free from the defect that many scholars and literati have. Intolerance for those who have dedicated themselves to the research that has no particular affinity with their own. In conversation, his style was familiar to the highest degree, and not scholarly, to the point that any stranger who had some knowledge of his works, but not of his person, would have found it difficult to believe that in this amiable and cordial companion they were in the presence of the profound author of the Transcendental philosophy." Kant then applied his critical method on one hand to ethics in groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals from 1785 and Critique of Practical Reason from 1788, and on the other hand to ethics and nature in the Critique of Judgment from 1790. He believed that his critiques were just the beginning of a full system of philosophy, divided into two parts: a theoretical philosophy, for example the metaphysics of nature, and a practical philosophy, for example ethics. He completed this system in 1797 with Metaphysics of Morals, where he discussed the laws and virtue. And he also applied his ideas to natural science in the Metaphysical Foundation of Natural Science from 1786, and worked on other projects, some of which remained unfinished. In the last period, we see Kant struggle with the tormenting decline of his faculties and with the pain, humiliation, and agitation of two illnesses, one affecting his stomach and the other one his head. But even between this harsh condition, above these painful illnesses, the goodness and nobility of his nature rose above them victoriously, until the end, as if on great wings. Kant's life was very simple and peaceful, guided by ethical principles and strict routines. After every lunch, for example, he liked to have a walk on his own, breathing some fresh air and meditating. Back home from the walk, he would sit on his work table and read until dusk. During those moments of uncertain light, so friendly to the thought, he remained in quiet meditation on what he had just read, provided the book was worth it. Otherwise, he prepared the plan for his lectures to the next day, or for some part of a book he was working on. During this state of harmony and tranquility, he would nestle, both in winter and in summer, near the stove, gazing out the window at the ancient tower of Löwenich. Not that he actually looked at it, but the tower rested on his eyes, like distant music reaching his ears, obscurely, only partially accessible to the consciousness. There is no word that can adequately convey the sense of gratification he derived from that old tower when he gazed at it at dusk in a dreamy quiet. Thomas de Quincey writes, "In fact, such was the purity of his life and the happiness of his condition, that no turbulent passion ever arose in him to agitate him, no worry succeeded in distressing him, no suffering ever forced him to awaken." Even in the harshest winter, his bedroom was without a fire. Only in his later years did he yield to pleas of his friends and allow a small fire to be lit. No sort of self-indulgent care could ever take hold of Kant. Like most German thinkers of his time, Kant was strongly influenced by the philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff, although he used their ideas mainly as a starting point. His pre-critical period, before publishing the Critique of Pure Reason, or at the least the 1770 Dissertation, shows a slow process of rethinking their ideas through the help of other philosophers like Lambert and Crucius, until he eventually moved beyond them. Kant's early writings can be divided into two groups. Scientific works. These show Leibniz's strong influence, especially in Kant's early ideas about physics. At first, he supports Leibniz's idea of force, mv squared, over the Cartesian one, mv. But later he starts to adopt Newtonian ideas, such as attraction and repulsion, replacing Leibniz's metaphysical view with a more mechanical explanation of the universe, as seen in the Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, and philosophical writings. Here, Kant's break from Wolff and Leibniz in metaphysics and epistemology is slower. In his early Nova Delucidatio, he accepts some of Wolff's principles, but already begins to question others. He introduces new principles related to time and space, and criticizes Wolff's purely logical and syllogistic method of building metaphysics, without a reference to experience. Kant argues that existence cannot be deduced by logic alone, it must come from experience. Kant sees that philosophy should not copy the synthetic method of mathematics, which connects ideas logically. Instead, philosophy must use analysis, breaking down given concepts to make them clear. He notices that this approach also has limits, especially when it comes to problems like causality, where cause and effect cannot be deduced from logic alone. In later works, like the attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes in philosophy from 1763, Kant begins to recognize the idea of real opposition between actual things as different from logical contradiction. Though he hasn't yet solved the problem of knowledge, by the mid-1760s, Kant understands that philosophy's job is not to build a perfect metaphysical system, like Wolff tried, but rather to study the limits of reason. In Dreams of a Spirit Seer, he states clearly that anything beyond experience, like spirits, is outside the bounds of knowledge. Kant's early philosophical works focus mostly on epistemology and metaphysics, but also touch on morality. In Inquiry into the Clarity of the Principles of Natural Theology and Morals from 1763, he criticizes Wolff's idea that morality is about becoming more perfect, because perfection is too vague. At this stage, Kant is more attracted to the moral sentiment theory of thinkers like Shaftesbury or Hutcheson. In Observations of the Feeling of Beauty and Sublime from 1764, he explores how emotions shape our ideas of beauty and the sublime, linking them to gender, personality, and national character. The text discusses Immanuel Kant's project of defining a science of the limit of reason, which he develops in his main work, Critique of Pure Reason. Kant explains that human reason is naturally driven to ask certain questions it cannot answer, especially in the field of metaphysics, which deals with the things beyond experience. This leads to confusion and contradictions. Kant wants to find out how knowledge is possible, especially in pure mathematics, pure physics, and metaphysics as science. Even though he claimed that David Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber, modern scholars think that Kant's shift to critical philosophy had deeper and more complex causes. Still, Hume's doubts about causality, the idea that one event necessarily causes another, were very important for Kant. Hume showed that we never actually see necessary connections in experience, just sequences of events. Kant agreed with this, but believed that science still needed these necessary connections, like for example cause and effect, in order to be able to work. So Kant looked for a new kind of knowledge, synthetic a priori judgments, statements that are both informative, synthetic, and universally valid, a priori, but not based only on experience or logic alone. Kant explained that mathematics and physics are built on these synthetic a priori judgments. For example, in 7 plus 5 equals 12, the result is not already in the original numbers, it is added through an intuitive process. Similarly, physics uses concepts like causality that aren't derived from experience but are necessary for understanding nature. Therefore, the main question of Kant's philosophy is: how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? Kant concludes that such judgments come not from the objects themselves, but from the human mind, which actively shapes experience. He compares this to Copernican's revolution. Just like Copernicus put the sun and the center instead of the earth, Kant puts the subject, the knowing mind, at the center of knowledge instead of the object. This shift leads to what Kant calls Transcendental philosophy, a philosophy that studies the conditions that make knowledge possible, based on the structure of the human mind. After completing the dissertation of 1770, which allowed him to obtain a university professorship, Kant withdrew from intellectual life and devoted himself mainly to two tasks. The first was teaching, which he always carried out with great dedication and patience. The other was rethinking the results he had achieved in the dissertation. That is, Kant realized that he had omitted some fundamental points in his work, which he now felt compelled to revisit and resolve. In a famous letter to his friend Hertz from 1772, Kant writes, "As I ponder the theoretical part in its entirety and with the interrelations of its all parts, I noticed that something essential was still lacking. Something that I, like others, had overlooked in my long metaphysical investigations, and which indeed constitutes the key to the whole mystery of metaphysics that had hitherto remained hidden even from itself. The spontaneous question that arises is, what is this key to the whole mystery of metaphysics? As he writes just a few lines below, the key is the foundation of the relationship between representation and object. That is, what does it mean to represent something? What is the relationship between our representation and the represented object? What is an object? Ultimately, this is the same problem that David Hume had raised years earlier when he had questioned the foundation of knowledge and therefore the relationship between man and the world. This question about the foundation of the representation-object relationship is the first way in which Kant begins to develop a priori knowledge, in other words, the Copernican Revolution. In fact, this question merely foreshadows the fundamental question of the Critique of Pure Reason: how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? But we will explore this point and the fundamental themes of the Critique of Pure Reason in the next video on Kant. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan and this is Empyrean, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.